Hi, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to those of you who are joining us this week for the first time or watching the recording, and welcome back people who are here for our original session. I'm Christine Valenza-Shin. I'm class of '84, and I'm the Associate Dean for Beyond Barnard, which is the college's hub for career advising and on-campus jobs and graduate school and fellowship advising and a couple of other key initiatives. So welcome, and I'm going to jump right into our session today on resumes, and feel free to participate via the chat. I'm going to throw out a couple of questions and you can ask questions as well. We're going to do a couple of other interactive things, and then at the end we'll have leave time for questions and answers. You can unmute if you would like and ask your question live, or you can type it to me directly or into the chat to everyone. So let me do a little screen sharing here. Great. And I seem to have lost my little button that lets me. Sorry. Okay, well, I'm going to assume you all can see this okay. It's not going to make for the prettiest presentation, but the key is to get started and get through through the slides and the information. So our title today is Resumes That Work, and subtitle highlighting your skills and accomplishments. And that's our main goal today, is to look at what for some of you will be a slightly different orientation on how to approach your resumes. Right. So as I noted last week, this presentation is part of the Beyond Barnard Summer Colloquium, which is our fancy name for our summer programming that we launched last summer in the midst of the pandemic to try and jump into the void of canceled or postponed internships and people on furlough and other economic workplace disarray. But we're continuing it this summer, even though things are looking up, and we want to continue the dialogue. As we did last week as well, we'll start with a nature image reminding us that it is summer outside, at least here in the Northeast, and take a breath. Reminder to me as well as you, take a little breath, take a moment to relax, and get ready to go over our topics. So what we're looking at today, some resume basics. I'm going to assume, since you're all graduates, that we don't need to go over the resume point by point by point. Hopefully you've done enough of them that you've got a general sense of how they're formatted and how they work. But we want to clue in on some basic good points. And then we'll look at one of our main topics today, which is how to highlight your achievements rather than just describe your job and your work. And then we'll do a little bit of practice, look at some ways you can make your bullets more effective, and then we'll summarize sort of big picture again, some of the do's and don'ts and frequently asked questions that come up from people. So great. So I'm going to ask you a quick quiz question, two quick quiz questions. Feel free to just think of your answer. You could throw it in the chat, although I don't have the chat visible at this point. So, but the first question is, what is the purpose of a resume? So think about that for a moment. Think about what first comes to mind. And there's a couple of different purposes, but for what we want to talk about today, we want to have a very strategic focus to our resume, which is the goal of a resume is to get an interview. And so this is certainly true if you're applying to a job. Your goal is to get to the next step of the process, which is generally it could be a phone screen or a first round interview. And in a networking situation, the purpose of the resume would be to get that conversation, or to share information about yourself on paper, in addition to sharing information on yourself in person. But the reason I like to ask this question is I think it's valuable to think about what you're doing. You're not trying to capture your entire work history. You're not trying to it's not an exercise in futility because nobody reads resumes anymore. People do still read resumes. But the main focus is a strategic one is what can I do? How can I write this resume so that I have the highest possible chance of getting an interview, getting to the next round of consideration? And then comes this classic question, how long does a potential employer initially spend looking at your resume? So again, you can just think to yourself what you think that answer might be. And the traditional wisdom is less than 30 seconds. Now, I took a little time to research this because this is one of these things, one of these career things that gets repeated over and over again over the years. I was reading a column recently that talked about, some of these come out of nowhere or from a very old study. But I did a little research and it was kind of interesting. A website organization called The Ladders, which is a career-related website, did an eye tracking analysis of recruiters looking at resumes. And this was just a couple of years ago. And what they found actually was that recruiters, now that could be slightly different from other types of hiring managers, but that recruiters spend 6 to 7 minutes, 6 to 7 seconds initially on a resume. And they because they did the eye tracking, what they saw, where their eyes went was the first thing they looked at was most recent job, followed by second most recent job. Quick glance over to the right to look at the dates and see how long you were at those jobs, and then a quick glance down to the bottom or the second page to see where you went to school, and then moved on. So I thought that was interesting. And part of what we want to look at today is how can a resume really needs to hold up to two views, that initial quick view, and then the deeper view. So generally what happens is people will mark the resumes in some way or set them aside in some way if they're looking at them physically to give that deeper look. And your resume has to hold up to both that quick initial judgment and then the deeper look at some of the details. So, oops. So some best practices on getting your resume to that closer look stage. This is some of the basics that you've probably heard before. But one major message is to customize your resume to the job description. And we'll talk about some of the practical ways to make that easier to do because that can feel daunting. And generally you are trying to make it as easy as possible for that person giving that quick glance. You want to make it as easy as possible for them to see that you're a good match for the job. And that's where the customizing comes in. As I said, we're going to talk, in more detail about focusing more on achievements and results than on what your tasks and responsibilities were. Advice on how quickly to apply to a job varies. I've seen people say 24 to 48 hours after it's posted. We encourage, that first week that a job is up, but it's important to take the time to customize it. So if applying within 24 to 48 hours means you're just going to send a generic resume that you haven't tweaked at all, then I would say it's worth taking an extra day or two to have the time to customize it, if you're not going to be able to get to it before then. So, and then another best practice is either before you submit, if the timing works out, or once you've submitted, reaching out to potential contacts, people you already know who used to work there or have a contact there, to try and get your resume in front of the person doing the hiring. That extra little plug can also help because no matter what you do, best practices wise, to get out of that big pile, having that little push from somebody to say, hey, take a closer look at this person's resume can be really helpful. Okay, so one way to help make this customizing part more manageable, which we teach this to students, and I've taught it to a lot of different alumni over the years, is to have is to set up a system where you have an everything resume and then an application and then application resumes, right? So the idea of the everything, it's sometimes called a master resume, is that this is going to be a single document. Could be super long, could be 15 bullets for each position. It doesn't matter because it's for your eyes only. Nobody else is ever going to see it except possibly me or another advisor if you want to share it. And the idea is that all of your work, volunteer, project experiences, skills, classes, et cetera, are all going to be together in this one document where you can easily find it and cut and paste. And it's a living document. In recent years, I've encouraged people to use this everything resume to write rough drafts of bullets. You might not be actively applying to things, but it definitely is helpful to, once a year or every 6 months, or maybe when you're having a performance review or asking for a promotion, to go in and just in regular English, write down some of the things you've been doing. And then later, if you are going to apply for something or you otherwise have to make a more official version of your resume, you can go in and change those rough draft bullets into resume speak. So, so the idea is that everything's in one place so that you're not having to track down, oh, I know I wrote a resume 2 years ago that included that volunteer work that matches up well with this. Where is it? The idea is to gradually get all the versions of your resume, all the different listings, even if relatively old stuff, in one place, just in case you might want to reference it. And then what you do from here is when you're applying to something, or perhaps you're having a networking meeting with someone and you want to have a copy of your resume in case they ask for it, or to follow as a send as a follow-up, these you would customize. So the key ways to customize, I'm not a fan of rewriting your whole resume. You don't have to start from scratch each time. And what you will find is they'll kind of clump together by category. So it's not like it's not like you're rewriting from scratch every time. But the idea is to look at a couple of things. One is to look at the heading for your main experience section and add a specific heading. So let's say you're applying to both communications related jobs and operations related jobs, right? More of the organizational, process type things. You would take the jobs and experiences you have that most correlate to, say, communications, and you would describe it. And instead of just saying professional experience or work experience, you would say communications experience or communications and marketing experience. You can use, I'd say 2. I've seen some versions of this where people will put in 3 words that sort of capture your label, your most relevant work, and it allows you to put up at the top and give the most real estate on your front page to the jobs, the experiences that are most relevant to what you're applying to. And then you can have a second resume, a second experience section that could be called additional experience or other experience or prior experience, something a little bit more generic, or it depends on the individual person. Sometimes if you've made a career shift, say you started out in teaching, as I did, you might have an education experience if it all kind of fits together neatly. But the idea is that this goes to the point I made earlier of making it as easy as possible for the person reading your resume to see that you're a good match. And so you're going to look for that title of that experience section that encompasses the experiences you want to put up front, front and center on that first page of your resume. Another key thing is to, and this is where I talk, say it's just about little tweaks, not so much about rewriting, but as if you're applying to a specific job with a detailed description, look for keywords and short phrases that they use a lot and see if you can integrate them into your bullets. And similarly, take a look at your bullets. Like let's say on your everything resume, you have 12 bullets for a particular job. You want to choose the 4 to 5, 4 to 6 maybe, that are most relevant to what they're looking for. And you can leave out other things. They may well have been an important part of the job you did, but they're not as relevant to what you're applying to. So, our dean likes to say resumes are a curated document. You are picking and choosing and highlighting the things that are most relevant to the person reading it. So, and then the order, a lot of us like to lay I know in older versions of my resume, I like to lay them out logically from maybe what I did the most to what I did the least, or the most general to the most specific. But instead you want to think about putting up top the things that are, again, most relevant to the job. So let's say in a job you only spent, say 10% of your time working on budgeting, but it's clear in the job you're applying to that budgeting is very important. It's fine to move budgeting up to the first or second bullet. Again, you're increasing the chances that somebody on that first skim are going to see the key things that they're looking for. So, okay. All right. So we get questions a lot about putting something up at the top, profiles or summary of qualifications. Sometimes people call it a skill summary. You don't even have to label it necessarily. Often people will put their heading, with their name and contact information, and then just have some space at the top. It's become a little bit more mainstream. It started a lot with tech resumes, where it's become where a recruiter or a hiring manager wants to see right at top, what are your hard skills in tech? What languages do you know? What programs do you know? And so it started to transition over to non-tech jobs. It is optional, and so you don't have to do this, and it doesn't always make sense on a resume. But there's a couple things that it can be helpful with. It can definitely it is an easy place to customize the resume. So without having to go through all of your entries and all of your bullets, it's a relatively easy place to edit and sort of highlight the particular skills, hard skills or soft skills that a job is looking for. So something to think about. It can be helpful if you're making some sort of shift, to a new field or a new role. Or if you've got a diverse work history, let's say you've done a lot of different things at a lot of different places, it can be a helpful way to pull together and kind of frame your experience. So, and we'll talk about this a little more when we get to LinkedIn profiles. It's kind of similar to on LinkedIn, there's an about section that comes up at the top before your experience section. And it's kind of the same concept to sort of shape a little bit, give an overall summary. So, okay. All right, so those were some of the basics. And now I want to spend some time on highlighting achievements. Right. So I'm going to start with a quote from one of my favorite outside of Beyond Barnard career resources, which is the Ask a Manager blog, authored by a woman named Allison Green, mostly out of the nonprofit sector, but it's a workplace advice column, highly entertaining, highly educational, and very, very good on a lot of job search stuff. If you go through her topics, she's got a lot of great tips for resumes, cover letters, interviewing, a lot of the stuff we're going to be, a lot of same topics we're going to be covering this summer. So this is basically her argument for moving away from describing your job and moving towards describing your accomplishments and being a little bit more individualized, a little bit more concrete, and that can be a much more effective way to jump out. Okay. So how do you do this? If you accept this argument from her and from me and from Beyond Barnard in general, how do you do this? So looking at, part of this is looking at valued skills, sort of big picture skills that, again, could be because you're trying to transfer those skills to a new role, or even if you're staying within the same industry, within the same title, it's thinking about what are the big picture skills, the things that our employers are looking for. So, and these aren't obviously all of them, but this is just to sort of get you thinking about what are some of the things that can highlight accomplishments and be a little bit more specific about your particular value. Right. So again, not a comprehensive list, but just to sort of get you thinking, and teaching doesn't mean to literally be a teacher, but training, mentoring, all of these are, sort of just the tip of the iceberg of some of these different roles. So when you're actually constructing a bullet, the way you can personalize this, the way you can focus in on achievement is to look at your action, right? And we'll talk about action verbs in a moment. Quantify where you can, but quantify doesn't just mean numbers like, increased sales by X percentage, or, it's great. If your job lends itself to that kind of data, that's great. But think about all of these things, a lot of this is about trying to give a sense of the scope of your job, as well as specific, where you did move the needle, quantifiably. So it can be frequency, it can be, web traffic, it can be percentages. There's a variety of ways of expressing quantity. And you don't need to include it in every single bullet. It's not going to be something to think about and to sort of ask, is there a way to quantify or otherwise measure this a little bit? And then you want to think about outcome. Did this achieve something, or what was the reason for doing this? If there's not always a clear achievement of every single bullet, but if you can give some context, what's the reason for doing what you did? All right. So there's some ideas there. And then writing a strong bullet, in our advice, is you always want to lead with a direct active verb, a strong verb. So these are just a handful from a couple of different categories. Give you some different synonyms, some different options. What we're trying to avoid is some of the weaker verbs. A lot of people use assisted. If assistant's in the title or intern is in your title, you don't need to call out assisting per se. It's okay to skip the assisted part and just say, promoted 3 events per week via company website. Even if you weren't the only one doing it, the fact that you were an intern or an assistant clearly communicates that you weren't the only one doing it, and so it just allows you to get to that more direct action. Okay. And then just a few more verbs, trying to give you lots of ideas. These are divided by industry roughly. Doesn't mean you can't use them in other industries, but the idea is to try and get you, think about some, using variety. You don't want to keep using the same word over and over again in your bullets. Again, thinking about that person skimming and just maybe reading the first couple of words in a bullet. Okay. When I pop out of screen sharing at the end, I've got a couple of links to, we have a resource on Handshake with, I think it's action verbs for resumes. And I also Googled that phrase, and there were a couple of interesting articles that popped up on various career websites that had a bunch of different things. So if you're having trouble, varying your language, there's lots of resources for that. But then let's get to the thing I think sometimes people struggle with more than vocabulary and varying their terms is, how do you actually capture achievements? It's easy often to just list your job responsibilities, a little bit harder to capture what actually made you good at the job, right? So take a look at a couple of these questions. And these are sort of prompting questions to get you to think about, ultimately, you're trying to think about the difference between doing your job well and doing your job exceptionally well, or doing a basic job, versus doing a more effective job. How can you capture some of that? The next to last bullet, the last 2 bullets are interesting. Sometimes it's hard for people, even in their own internal dialogue, and often when we ask, in an advising session, sometimes people struggle with this, sort of thinking about analyzing their own performance and saying out loud what makes you good at something. Definitely want to encourage you out of your, if you are uncomfortable with that, to encourage you to get more comfortable with that. It's important to think about in specific ways, what makes you good at what you do. But then we include the last bullet because sometimes it is easier to think of that in the context of what would a colleague that values you, a manager that's worked with you for a while, what would they say about you? What would they say were your strengths? And think about if you can capture that. So now I want to give you a little bit of practice, right? And I'm going to give you script, some sample achievement bullets. So you could take one of these and just fill in the blank, because it might apply to something you've done either in a work situation or a volunteer situation, or maybe you want to adapt it a little. Some of these might not, be super applicable to what you do. But I'd love each of you to pick one of these to either fill in the blanks or otherwise adapt. And I'm going to stop sharing actually, let me keep it up while you pick one. And then I'll duck out for a minute. And if you, if anybody's willing to share it in the chat, I would love to see some samples. So take a minute, pick one of these, fill in the blanks, or, maybe vary it to apply more to what you do. You could jot it down for yourself, or better yet, if you are willing to share it in the chat, that would be great. So I'm going to stop sharing in just a second so I can see some of your answers. I'll just ask Claire to unmute for a moment and let me know if anything is popping up in the chat.
We've got one piece of feedback in the chat.
Cool. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing for just a moment so that I can take a look at that and we can share that, and hopefully a couple other people will be brave as well and share theirs. Sought out by colleagues to be recruited to their team. Good. So I like that. So you moved from one team to another. And that, again, you're speaking to value. It wouldn't be the only bullet you put. It would, you'd obviously have other bullets that focused on some of the specifics of what you did, but I like that. Garnered praise from special education manager for advocacy for students during IEP reviews. Nice. I like that. Kept the seafloor mapping project running smoothly while project manager was on long-term leave, which included academic, private, state, federal partnerships, and resulted in the first series of maps. Nice. I like that. That would be, I would put that full bullet in your everything resume and then think about it's pretty long. You might want to divide it up. But I think that's a great example of where sometimes you're asked to step in, on a project because somebody's missing or somebody leaves the company, and that's a great thing to capture. Sought out by colleagues to move contracts through complicated procurement process. Awesome. Built reputation for being knowledgeable about regulations and accessible. Nice. Yeah, this is great. You guys are definitely, these are good examples, and feel free to keep working on those. I'm going to go back to sharing, but we can look at more of those if they come in. So cool. All right. So now let's go over back to the sort of big picture. Let's do some of the do's and don'ts and FAQs. Some of these are repeating some of the points I've made earlier, and some of them are new. Okay. So as I mentioned, I didn't go, we didn't break down the basics of format as we would do with, say, entering students or people who are brand new to writing a resume. But some of the formatting things that you've learned in the past are important here. This is where making sure that you're paying attention to font and being consistent about bolding and italicizing and just having a system for that. The idea, again, is when somebody's skimming quickly, not only does it make your resume sort of just look better in that initial visual impression, but anything that sort of stops the reader, stops the skimming, is going to interrupt that flow and potentially make them sort of set aside your resume. So you're looking for being clear, being consistent, and all of that. All right. The 1 or 2 page document that's highlighted in yellow. We get a lot of questions. It used to be we used to be stricter about this. There used to be stricter rules that everyone should stick to a 1-page resume unless you were, and people would even give estimates, like maybe after 5 to 7 years of experience, you could shift to 2 pages. Definitely in the digital age, there's less concern with sticking to 1 page. I mean, there are exceptions to this, and you should always, sometimes within certain industries, like I would argue that a lot of tech resumes do try very hard to be only 1 page long, but tech is a big category. So it's a helpful thing to talk to your network about, if there are norms within it. But generally speaking, 1 or 2 pages is fine. But this does get into the curating idea that, as you move along in your career, and even early in your career, if you, for instance, had a lot of different internships, or you're in an industry where it is normal to move fairly quickly from job to job, or maybe you were doing contract work. It can sometimes take more than 2 pages to encompass everything, and that's where you have to make line things and leave some things out. So, all right, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment as well, because it comes up under the notes. I think we already talked a fair amount about making it achievement or outcome. We talked strong active verbs and quantifying where possible. So basically reviewing some of those key things. So some don'ts. My friends from the 70s and 80s, we were all taught to put an objective, and even into the 90s, we were taught to put an objective at the top of the resume, and that is completely passé at this point, especially if you label it that way. And we were also all taught to type across the bottom. Notice I say type for us oldsters. References available upon request. Those are 2 things that just scream dated. So you want to edit those out if you still have those lingering around any versions of your resumes. The objective is gone for 2 reasons. Part of this is the shift that took place in the 2000s between the 2008-2010 recession and the digitalization of the process. It became, I guess, what we call an employer's market. So the idea isn't, whereas in the 80s and 90s, the whole idea behind the objective was like, this is what this job will do for me. And we've really had sort of a sea change to the whole sort of thrust of your resume and your cover letter is, here's what I can do for you, not what the job's going to do for me, but what I'm going to bring to the job or to your organization. And so that's part of why objectives have gone away. And as I say, they've been replaced in some cases by skill summary or a professional summary. But it's also fine to just go to your first section, which if you're a recent grad would be education, and if you've been out for a while would be your experience section. So you want to try and avoid the sweeping, sweeping statements for the more specific things we talked about on the previous slides before. Where can you quantify it? Can you use sort of direct examples rather than using these more subjective adjectives? We get a lot of questions about, and there's a lot of templates out there for less conventional formats or more graphically designed. Those are the exception. In general, you're still better off applying to most jobs with a simple Word document or a PDF, that's not graphically designed. There are some relatively simple templates out there that just add a little bit of color, a little bit of, visual interest, and that's fine. But then there's others that go further where it's, a word map or a complete sort of redesign of how the information is presented. And you just want to be judicious in using those. I personally, I'm actually we're in the middle of hiring for a couple of positions, and it doesn't bug me to come across one that's different. It does take a second. I have to sort of as I'm going through that big pile, it takes a minute to sort of readjust and be like, oh, okay, things are in different places. Where's the education section? Where's the skill section? It doesn't tend to annoy me, but there are many other recruiters and hiring managers out there that it does really annoy. So, so that's the argument for not doing that. But there are exceptions. And so if you are applying to something in a creative or visual field, you probably do want to, sort of, it becomes a sample of your design capabilities. And then it's also true that at innovative companies or organizations, that describe themselves as cutting edge or out of the box, or we do things differently, or we're disruptors, they might respond really positively to a disruptor resume, a different looking resume that sort of approaches information in a different way. So, and the next bullet just refers to, again, curate, edit. You're not trying to fit everything you've ever done in, you're picking and choosing so that, things look not teeny tiny and squished together. Right. And using the same resume for every position. We already talked about that. And then using the generic category titles like experience or work experience, volunteer experience, try and move away from those and instead categorize them, as I said, sort of according to the skill set, the experience set that you want to demonstrate. And then take some of the other jobs that don't fit that category and put them, that can have a more generic term like additional or prior, something like that. Okay. Some FAQs. I mentioned this earlier. It's interesting. When we work with alumni a couple years out, they're very loath to move their education down. They want to keep leading with Barnard and Columbia or their graduate school. And it's just the general rule of thumb is if your degree, whether it's an undergraduate degree or graduate degree, is the most relevant thing to what you're applying to, then you can continue to lead with it. But generally speaking, once you're out of school a while, whether that's undergrad or graduate, your experience, your current and most recent experience is going to be the thing that's most relevant to the person looking at your resume. But again, if you're a brand new college grad, even if you have specific internship experience, still one of the sort of most relevant things about you is that you just finished, just earned a degree from Barnard, and so you could lead with that. And certainly, if you go back to graduate school to learn a new skill set or to get further refine your training and education, then you can lead with that as well. Title of organization doesn't really matter. You just need to be consistent. You can't change it around. So if you worked for big name companies or organizations, you can't lead with the organization in some cases and the title in others. So look at your most recent jobs. Is the title more impressive than where you're working, or is it the reverse? And you can go from there. And then this comes up a lot. Do you hide your age or own it? It's definitely shifted. I've been doing this work for over 10 years now. And back 10 years ago, we were still basically advising people, if you try and hide your age, they're going to know you're hiding your age and they're going to assume that you are older than you are maybe. So don't do it. But it's become so common now to leave the dates off of your education and cut off some of the early work that it's become so common that it actually is hard to tell whether that, and I've seen people as, still in their 20s do that. I don't think it's necessary, but, ageism is out there more strongly in some areas than others. So, so that's the reason sometimes people do it. I've always been a big advocate for owning your age and your experience. So I sort of lean towards that side, but there are plenty of, again, it's become quite common to try and shave off, 5 to 10 years, depending on how old you are and how experienced you are. So, okay. Going back over the one page or two. I am going to say though, if you can't fit your relevant experience into 2 pages. The exception of this is in academic settings where you are asked for a curriculum vitae, which is can be a much longer document. But if you're asked for a resume, try really hard not to go beyond 2 pages. I was, one of the jobs we're searching for is for a career that we're hiring for is a career advisor. And I have to say, I was a little, for people who are applying to be career advisors, there were an awful lot of 3 and 4 page resumes, which I was not happy about. It just makes you have to look too hard through it to see the relevant parts. I want to curate it. I want you to take one page, maybe 2, to show me, the most relevant experience that aligns with what, I'm looking for. So, at the top, a lot of people, I've noticed recently, a lot of people will put their city and state, but not their street address. I think a lot of that arose out of privacy concerns. But there is this weird thing called address prejudice, which can be anything from, I don't know, making a conscious or unconscious judgment about the affluence or lack of affluence or whatever else is associated with a particular part of town or a particular suburb, et cetera. I think probably even more directly, people could, make an assessment of what your commute's going to be like. Less relevant in our current atmosphere where there's a lot of remote work going on, but as people start to come back to work, these things can come into play. So again, you're going to have to give your address probably in the online application, but you don't need to shout it out across the resume right at the beginning. So, the last point is just a general rule of thumb. There's exceptions to this, but generally you want to, if you're emailing it to somebody, it is good to save it as a PDF so that when they open it up, your formatting is preserved. You can do either a Word document or a PDF in an online system. They'll often tell you which they prefer, but where you are uploading your resume and cover letter, those are called generally applicant tracking systems or ATS, and sometimes they're more able to read Word documents than they are PDFs, but it's not a hard and fast rule. So do what you're most comfortable with or what you're directed to do within a specific online thing. So I'm just checking on the time here. Oh, good. We've got some time. So just a couple of final thoughts. As I said, I've been doing this for a long time. And people really struggle over writing most people struggle to some degree in having to update their resume, change the way they think about the resume. And it's going to take some work, and it is a really important part, as we laid out last week, in sort of getting ready for a job search. You need to have an updated, effective resume, that's good to go or close to being good to go. But if you follow the system of the everything resume versus the application resume, and if you are steadily applying to things, it should get easier. The first couple of times can be time consuming, but it should get smoother. The tweaking should take less time. And as I said earlier, your resumes are going to kind of clump together in groups. So instead of having to go back to the drawing board each time, if you apply to a job at Amnesty International, and then 2 weeks later you apply to a similar job at Human Rights Watch, you don't have to start from scratch. You can pull up the Amnesty International one, maybe tweak it a little bit because maybe the Human Rights Watch role is addressing a few very particular things and you want to put those in. But otherwise it should get smoother and easier. If you're really struggling with customizing your resumes and it's taking a lot of time and effort and sort of slowing you down, then definitely check in with myself or one of our other advisors, and we'd be happy to sort of help you, sort of manage that a little bit better if you're struggling. So before I stop screen sharing, just reminding you that we have more sessions coming up. You're welcome to attend any and all of them. You don't have to come every week. There's no quizzes. There's no, they each are standalone, even though they're linked and related to each other. We'll dive into the world of cover letters next week. And then some of my colleagues are going to jump in on the next few topics, the LinkedIn profile, the networking, and the interviewing. And then I'll be back to wrap up the series with negotiating your job offer and then some thoughts about managing your ongoing professional development once you have a job. And you, as I said last week, you are welcome to make an advising appointment now or anytime during the series, or even long after the series when you're ready if you need shake. If you've had an appointment prior, if you're a relatively recent graduate, you can just go straight to Oh, I think I might have, it says my internet is unstable. Hopefully you can still hear me and see me. So if you're familiar with Handshake, in other words, you can go straight on there and make an appointment with myself or one of the other members of the team. But if you're not sure if you have a hand or never been on, you could email our staff at Beyond Barnard at barnard.edu, and they can check and see if you have an active account and help stuff. Okay. Just don't email me directly for an appointment. That just takes longer. So either go through Handshake or go through the general one, and we'll get you set up. Okay. Oops. Okay, great. So we will, let me stop sharing and take some questions. Oh, good. I'm glad people can still see. All right, so first question, how are the slides and recording being distributed? So basically, Alumni Relations has the registration list. So we need to, sorry, it's an easy enough answer. We're going to upload it to, we share the recording and they upload it to their YouTube, and we eventually upload it to our YouTube channel, sort of post. And then also, right after the session, I will share a PDF of the slides with them. So you should be getting that by the end of each week. But if you don't get it by the end of each week, you'll get it Monday or Tuesday of the following week. So now that we sort of smoothed out the system after last week. So hopefully, hopefully that will work. So we got a direct question. Uploading to an application system. If you upload your resume, do you also have to fill out the system prompts? Yeah. Like I said, we're in the middle of doing a couple of hires, and it depends on, I think most systems require you to both upload and break it down, but you can do, you don't have to vary them. So I know a lot of people are doing through the Barnard system is there from either their cover letter or the resume, and just cutting and pasting it into the individual prompts within the system, and that's fine. You don't have to come up with new ways of describing the same thing. Good question. I graduated in 2017, so have almost 4 years of experience under my belt. Should I remove internships at this point? So I'd say a qualified yes. You certainly can. I especially wouldn't include necessarily all of your internships. But the one caveat to that would be if you did an internship that was particularly well suited to the work you're applying to, maybe it was a very similar role or at a very similar organization, you might want to find a way to include it. And again, that's where having that primary section of experience that you've labeled, communications experience or, training and training experience or legal and research experience, that umbrella will allow you to bring in possibly your current work, but then maybe an old internship and sort of group it together as being very, very relevant, even if it leaves a gap. You need to do reverse chronology within the section, but it's okay to have gaps. And then the, jobs you maybe had in between, but weren't as relevant, you could put in a different section. So I'd say in general, 4 years out, you're probably going to start dropping some, if not all of the internships, but it's not an absolute. It kind of depends on the relevance. I'm applying to an internal job. Should I take any different steps when reviewing my resume? That's a good question. I would say the key, you wouldn't in and of itself do anything differently from the general advice I've given, but what you've got when you're doing it internal is some internal, sort of some inside information. And so you might want to see what you can find out, especially informally, about, especially if it's a different team, sort of a different manager, you might want to see if anybody can give you some insight on what's particularly important to them about who they hire, or what, if they have any pet peeves about resumes. You may or may not have the resources to do that, and you might it's always tricky when you're applying internally. I know you're not necessarily telling everyone. So, but yeah, I would basically do the same thing, but see if you can't find out a little bit of information about, what's important in the job or what they're looking for. So, are there exceptions to the 1 to 2 page rule? For instance, if applying for executive director or COO position when they're looking for a lot of leadership experience. Yeah, it's true. If you're very high up, you're going to have more leeway, right? So if we're talking about, I don't know what's commonly, yeah, like the two you mentioned, like executive director or chief operations officer, or, any of those things. Yeah, I think that that's where you will see a resume that's going, over 2 pages. I would still make the argument that you want to curate it. You want to think about how you're arranging that information so that, for instance, the leadership and the management experience is closer to the beginning. But yeah, I think that's a good point, that for very high up positions, a lot of the rules, the length rule can, be adapted. Okay. Any other questions? If you don't feel like typing, you feel free to unmute if you would like to just ask directly. All right. Well, thank you all for joining, and for your good questions, and for your good examples that you shared with each other. And I look forward to seeing some of you one-on-one, and continuing to see you week to week in these sessions. So have a great week, and we'll see you again next week.